And the early part of the evening, going into the 7 and 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock portion, and recall that the doctor was shot in the central time zone, so we were 1 hour ahead of that. But at about 10 o'clock our time, in an area not too far from the communication center, we began to get calls of people assembling and marching in the street, and some disorderly conduct, if you will. Some dumpsters being set afire, some cars being set afire and turned over. And all the time we're kind of doing what fire dispatchers do, take calls and dispatch units. But at the same time, you could almost feel in the air a sense of tension and a sense of apprehension building that was fostered by the tragedy that had unfolded a few hours earlier. And then at about the 11 o'clock hour, at about the time that you would normally begin to look forward to getting off duty, things really went south in a hurry. And rioters began to set stores afire, buildings afire of all manner, apartment houses afire. And here I was on the radio, and remember, please, that it was 1968.
Right.
There was no CAD. There was no 911. There were no multiple channel trunk radio systems. There were no mobile data terminals. There was no incident command system, because that's the way it was in 1968. Mm-hmm. And within literally an hour, we had major problems on our hands insofar as a particular area of Washington, which was only about 20 blocks north of the White House. So for the folks that know the layout of Washington, D.C., it's in the northwest section of the city, and 20 blocks from the White House is where all of this rioting and burning was occurring. And here I was on the radio with two channels, a primary channel and a mutual aid channel, and a yellow pad and a pencil. And it was, and you have to be a firefighter and you have to be a dedicated 911 person and a public safety oriented person to appreciate this. But it was, the adrenaline was flowing.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine.
You were rising to the occasion, if you will. Mm-hmm. Your mind was racing ahead. You were being very anticipatory. Because I had the good fortune of being stationed normally in that area of the city, I knew it very well. My partners were on duty that night in the field. My platoon was in fact working. So I knew my guys were there, and if I had not been on light duty, I would have been there with them. But as the evening wore on, the fires got worse, and then there was presidential declarations made declaring a national emergency, and the National Guard was called in, and very quickly the assets of the Washington, D.C. Fire Department became depleted, which was a fairly good-sized fire department. This is 32 engine companies, 17 truck companies, 3 rescue squads, 8 battalions. So this is not a small fire department.
Right.
And they had been preliminarily trained for the possibility of riots by nature of what had happened around the nation before the 4th of April, 1968. And the gentleman that was the director of the communications center at that time, a gentleman by the name of James Flynn, and one of my greatest mentor in my entire career, a visionary of his day, but foresaw the possibility that as the tension rose in the nation long before the assassination, that the fires that had struck elsewhere might strike Washington, D.C. He had prepared a huge 25-foot long series of plywood placards, and with very fundamental things, paper tags and little hooks that you screw into wood, and lines on the plywood that would designate jurisdictions that surrounded Washington, companies within those jurisdictions, and then the tags indicated what companies they were, as a means to, gosh forbid anything ever happen, we would have some very, very primitive, very elementary mechanism to keep tabs of who was doing what where. And by about 1 o'clock that morning, that device was brought into play. And it was the only thing that really allowed any of us to really know who was where, because things were happening so quickly on either one of two channels. And channel one, the primary, which was being used by those units that were on the scene, was as busy as you can imagine. And the other channel, which was for mutual aid, was rapidly becoming saturated with suburban mutual aid units coming into the city, looking for a direction, wanting to know where to go, what to do, who to report to. So it was really a pretty challenging thing, and I'm just really glad that I was there. In public safety, as I hope many of your listeners can appreciate, it's a passion. It's not just a job. And although you never would want to wish ill will or bad things to happen to people, but because we live in a world where stuff happens, I think a lot of us would say, if it's got to happen, I want to be on duty when it does, and I like to be on the scene, if you will. So that sense kind of prevailed, and I was just very, 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 very fortunate to be where I was. And as the day and the evening wore on, with so much stuff going on, and no means of really keeping good records of it, except for a pad of paper, which oftentimes you had to abandon simply because of the volume of radio traffic.
Yeah.
And somebody else was luckily working with me, handling these little round paper tags, and you've seen them with the little metal thing that goes around. They're about the size of a quarter.
Yes.
And he's there, hanging these things up and taking them off and moving them from here to there. So we try to track where these units are going. It was something. And as both the change of shifts normally occurred, and as the word got out, and you again know how public safety people are, when something's going on, you don't have to call them back to work. They're coming back to work.
Yeah, exactly.
And people came into the center that were on 3 days off and all kinds of stuff. So they didn't need to be there, but that's the way it is in our world. And everybody would come up and say, what can we do to help you? And let me relieve you. And it was very, very difficult to do that, because you had such a body of knowledge that's kind of swirling around in your head. It wasn't like the normal change of shifts where you get up and say, listen, we got this and we got that, and you just walk away from it, and somebody else plugs in and they take over. That wasn't the way it was. You had 100 units plus out there, all of it swirling around in your head, and all kinds of stuff going on that made a change of shift very, very difficult to do. So it was resolved that. And I was asked about this by the chief operator. He says, do you want to stay there? Should you stay there? And I said, I think I better stay here. So I had the good fortune of kind of just toughing it out. And again, to your listeners who I guess are people like me and us, that when really you're engaged in something, adrenaline is flowing, and being tired or being hungry fades from your thought process. You're doing your job.
Right.
I remember vividly, although things did taper off a little bit towards 5 o'clock in the morning, it wasn't very long before things began to pick up again. And I guess I stayed there in the chair except for a quick run to the men's room from time to time, and people bringing me a soda, or you couldn't go out and get anything. I mean, whatever you were eating was either in the refrigerator already, or maybe by that time the National Guard had ringed the building, and they were guarding it with their weapons drawn. Tear gas was all over the place. It was a warm April, so the windows were open. We had no air conditioning, so tear gas is waffling through the room.
Jeez.
The National Guard folks brought us all gas masks, and I called them snoots. They were gas masks that had kind of looked like a can of vegetables on the front of them, and that was the filter. And it was a filter designed for tear gas. So you had this mask on, and every time you talk, you'd have to lift the edge of the mask off and say something, and then push it back over your mouth. It was absolutely crazy, if you will. But it didn't end there. I mean, it kept on going. The next day arrived. There was a Friday. Things were rocking all day long. The fire spread from one big area, and there was a lot of fire now, many hundreds and hundreds of buildings in the middle of a city. This isn't like a wildland fire that we read about today that consumed 100 houses. These are big buildings. These are 4 and 5 and 6-story brick buildings, stores. This was a big conflagration, but it spread from the northeast area of the city, which is kind of nearer to the Capitol building.
Uh-huh.
So you had these three, any one of them would have been a conflagration, and we had 3 of them going on at one time. And it was interesting, the camaraderie of public safety.